In the middle of 2024, in Abidjan, a small e-commerce company that most of the African tech industry had barely heard of quietly did something almost none of its more famous peers had done. It closed the year at $4.1 million in revenue, and at that revenue, it reached operational break-even. In a decade dominated by African consumer platforms, burning through hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital and never once turning a profit, this one small francophone marketplace, run out of Côte d'Ivoire, had figured out how to make the numbers add up. 8 months later, on the 7th of May, 2025, a French holding company called Mansart, registered in Paris, walked into a Paris commercial court and filed a formal declaration that it could no longer pay its bills. Mansart was the parent company of that Abidjan operator. The Abidjan operator was profitable. The Paris parent was not. On the 29th of July, 2025, the same court declared Mansart legally dead and put its assets, including its Ivorian subsidiary, on the block. 3 months after that, a newly formed New York fashion company almost nobody had heard of walked in and bought the whole thing in a distress sale for a price nobody would disclose, but that everyone in the room knew was well below what the investors had put in. This is the story of Anka, the company that proved a hard business and could not survive its own cap table. Welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of Anka, a Malian founder, an Abidjan warehouse, a Paris holding company, and a Visa plus DHL workaround stack that turned 22,000 African artisans into exporters, selling handbags in Paris and jewelry in Brooklyn. And then, at the moment the whole thing finally worked, watched it die anyway, not because the business was bad, but because of where the money was legally sitting. Let's get into it. The story of Anka does not begin in Abidjan, and it does not begin in Paris. It begins in Bamako, Mali, in 1988, the year Moulay Tabouret was born. Moulay grows up in Bamako, sits his baccalaureate, and does what many bright young Malians of his generation with the option to leave will do. He leaves. He goes to Paris. He studies at Paris Dauphine and finishes with a master's degree in audit and consulting in extended enterprise information systems, which is a long name for what he actually became. A corporate internal auditor. For roughly a decade, Moulay is not building a company. He is inside them. He starts at Orange in Mali in 2008. He moves to IBM, then SFR, then PwC, the accounting firm where he does information technology audit, and finally to the Alstom Group, the French rail engineering firm, where, by the time he is in his mid-20s, he is internal audit team leader. On paper, he is a French corporate finance careerist. He is not, on paper, an African tech founder. But somewhere in the middle of that corporate audit decade, roughly between 2013 and 2015, Moulay does something that will explain almost everything that follows. He takes out a loan, he flies home to Bamako, he walks into an auto market, and he buys a Sotrama. The Sotrama is the green and yellow shared minibus that is Bamako's default public transport. He puts his former chauffeur behind the wheel, and he tries, from Paris, to run a passive income minibus business on the other side of the Sahara. The Sotrama does not go well. Over almost 2 years, Moulay learns, painfully, everything his corporate audit career had not taught him. Drivers, maintenance, breakdowns, revenue leakage, discipline, cash management, fieldwork. The Sotrama teaches him that in West Africa, the operator's problem is not demand. The problem is operational trust. Years later, when he is asked to explain the through line of his career, he will say the issue has always been the same: how to build more reliable, more professional, more inclusive, and more useful services. In 2016, in Abidjan, Moulay stops running the Sotrama, leaves the corporate audit career behind, and, with 2 co-founders, incorporates a new company. Abdul Kadri Diallo, of Guinean heritage, becomes the operations lead. He will become Chief Operating Officer. Luc Peruso Diallo takes the product and technology side. Moulay becomes Chief Executive. They call the company Africrea, and the thesis is 1 line long. African artisans, tailors, jewelry makers, and small designers are already producing beautiful, saleable products, and the buyers already exist, mostly in the African diaspora, in Paris and New York. Plus, a growing cohort of non-diaspora buyers curious about African fashion. What does not exist is the plumbing between the two. Etsy does not ship well out of Bamako. eBay will not settle a payment to a Kenyan bank. Instagram will drive the discovery, but Instagram will not fulfill the order. Africrea launches in 2016 as the plumbing. A marketplace where African makers open a free storefront and Africrea takes a small commission on every sale. The choice of Abidjan is a logistics choice, not Bamako, where Mole was born, not Lagos, where every other African tech founder was raising, not Nairobi. Abidjan has the port. Abidjan has the DHL hub. Abidjan has flight connectivity to Paris, and Abidjan sits in the CFA franc zone, which shares a currency and a language across most of Francophone West Africa. Mouleye's own framing, later, would be that Francophone Africa is harder to build in than Anglophone Africa because the ecosystem is thinner and that the extra difficulty produces more resilient companies. It was, in 2016, a market almost no African tech investors were looking at. That was the whole point. For the first 4 years, Africrea does the unglamorous work of stitching together a two-sided marketplace in a market where neither side had a working platform to graduate from. Sellers come slowly, buyers come slowly, but they come. By 2019, 3 years in, Africrea reports more than 5,000 designers on the platform and roughly $5 million in cumulative sales into buyers in 101 countries. It is still, at that stage, a small company. But it is a real one. In February 2020, Africrea closes its first institutional check, $1 million in seed capital, led by a Francophone Africa fund based in Paris called Savio Ventures, with participation from a small French angel fund called ID4 Ventures. It is the smallest possible round that lets the company breathe, and then, 30 days later, the world stops. The pandemic, which will crush most of the global consumer economy, does something specific and counterintuitive to Africrea. It accelerates it. Because when physical retail closes, the African seller who used to sell into a Lome market or a Nairobi weekend fair has nowhere to go. And the Parisian buyer, sitting at home with a laptop and no restaurants to spend at, has time to browse. Africrea reports 250% year-on-year growth through the pandemic period. But growth of that shape exposes a very specific problem. The seller can list the dress, the buyer can pay for it. Neither of them can, on their own, close the transaction. In the CFA franc zone, and in Nigeria, and in Kenya, and in much of the continent, moving foreign currency card revenue into a local mobile money wallet is a multi-week paperwork exercise. Central banks want their forms. Compliance officers want their proofs. And DHL Express's published tariffs from Bamako to Paris for a single one-off parcel are punitive. A $60 handbag cannot ship for $20 in freight and remain a business. Moulay and his co-founders sit inside their office in mid-2020 and stare at 3 problems written on a whiteboard. Forex, logistics, trust. The Forex problem, they conclude, needs a European settlement layer, where the buyer's euros or dollars land inside the Eurozone and Africrea disburses to the seller as a service, rather than the seller trying, herself, to import the foreign currency. The logistics problem needs a wholesale DHL contract, where Africrea aggregates thousands of parcels a month into a single commercial rate and resells that rate back to the seller. And the trust problem needs an escrow arrangement, where the buyer's money is held until DHL confirms delivery. None of these 3 problems is glamorous. All 3 of them have to be solved together. Because the day you solve 2 of the 3, the sale still does not close. The pivot Moulay starts articulating publicly in late 2020 and into 2021 is a repudiation of the entire prevailing model of African e-commerce. Companies like Jumia, Konga, Kilimall, and Kopia in the same period had raised hundreds of millions of dollars trying to persuade African consumers to buy imported goods on credit they could not sustain. Moulay's argument was that Africa was not structurally a buyer market. It was a seller market, and the trick was not to force African consumers to spend money they did not have. It was to help African sellers move product to consumers who did have money. Abroad. Export, not import. That single sentence, he would tell Semaphore 2 years later, was the whole thesis of the business. On the 28th of April, 2021, Africrea announced the thing it had spent 2 years building underneath the marketplace. A new operating layer, launched under a new brand called Anka. Anka would sit on top of 2 specific partnerships. One with DHL Express, which had agreed to give Africrea an aggregate wholesale shipping contract so that a leather worker in Bamako, paying to ship a single parcel to Paris, would pay a rate closer to a small Parisian business than a walk-in DHL retail customer. And one with Visa, which would let the same seller accept a Paris card payment, or a New York card payment, or a London card payment into a euro-denominated settlement account held at the French parent company. Both partnerships took roughly 2 years to negotiate. Both were unusual. and together they were the entire economic unlock. Anka, the software product, was, on the front end, a Shopify for Africa, a dashboard where a Nigerian jeweler or an Ivorian shoemaker could build a storefront, list products across the Anka marketplace and their own website and their Instagram at the same time, and manage every order from a single inbox. On the back end, it was a Stripe plus DHL for Africa. The seller printed a DHL waybill from the dashboard. The buyer paid a Visa card into the Paris settlement account. Anka took a small spread on the payment, a small margin on the shipping, and a subscription fee for the software itself. The freemium ladder started at €0. It rose to roughly €10 a month for full commerce features. 8 months after the SaaS layer launched, on the 11th of January, 2022, Anka closed a $6.2 million pre-Series A round. It was, at that point, the largest single check a francophone West African consumer company had raised in years. The round was led by Investisseurs et Partenaires, a francophone Africa fund based in Paris, and the new investor list was unusual. The Bestseller Foundation, the philanthropic arm of the Danish fashion group behind Vero Moda and Jack & Jones, a Japanese cross-border fashion e-commerce operator called Enigmo, a Chicago fund called Vested World, a Lagos angel network called Rising Tide Africa, and notably one personal check from a specific individual, Joe Tsai, the co-founder of Alibaba, the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, widely reported to have invested in Anka personally through his family office network. It was not a huge check on the scale of his balance sheet, but its presence on the cap table sent a signal. On the same day the round closed, the company formally rebranded. Africrea, the marketplace, was folded into Anka, the operating brand. At the time of the round, Anka reported 7,000 sellers on the platform, buyers from 170 countries, and roughly $35 million in cumulative marketplace transactions since inception. Total capital raised to date across seed and pre-Series A was $8.1 million, which, on any comparable metric to Jumia, Konga, or the rest of the African Amazon field, was a rounding error. Anka's competitors had raised 20 times as much and were still, structurally, losing money on every transaction. On the 19th of September, 2023, 20 months after the pre-Series A, Anka announced a $5 million pre-Series A extension, and the lead investor changed the whole picture. The International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank, led with a $3.4 million equity check. Alongside them came Proparco, the French development finance institution, and BPI France, the French public investment bank. The round was a mix of equity and debt. And for the International Finance Corporation, the equity check had a specific significance. It was their first ever investment, on record, in Africa's creative sector. That milestone, more than the money itself, was what gave the round its narrative weight. At the time of the round, Anka's numbers had shifted decisively. 20,000 active sellers across the platform, 80% of them women. More than 1 million monthly visits to the marketplace. $50 million in cumulative marketplace transactions. And turnover, in the reporting language of the French parent, had grown 18 times in the 20 months since the previous round. From €200,000 a year to €3.6 million a year. Total capital raised, across all rounds, was now $13.5 million, which, on the metrics that mattered to the industry, was still a fraction of what any Anglophone African e-commerce peer had ever raised. Through 2024, Anka scaled through the last increment of growth it would ever record under its founders. By the end of the year, the platform had roughly 22,000 active sellers across 47 of Africa's 54 countries, feeding a buyer base of roughly 350,000 across 175 countries. Roughly 90% of the buyer revenue came from France and the United States, which meant, when you looked at it clearly, Anka was not really an African consumer platform. It was an African seller platform, and its consumers lived in the diaspora. That was the export thesis Moulay had drawn on a whiteboard 4 years earlier, and it was, by the numbers, working. And Anka did the thing almost no other funded African consumer platform did in the same period. It closed 2024 at $4.1 million in revenue, and it hit operational break-even. Cumulative gross merchandise value crossed $60 million. More than 10 tons of physical cargo left the continent every month. 10,000 jobs had been supported across 46 African countries since the company's founding. It was, by any measure, of what the venture-backed African consumer sector had been trying to do for a decade. A proof of thesis. And it was in that moment, at that number, that the trap sprang. Anka's operating unit in Abidjan was profitable, but the equity capital and the debt and the historical operating losses of the previous 8 years all sat inside a French holding company called Mansart, incorporated in Paris. On the 7th of May, 2025, Mansart filed a formal declaration in Paris that it could no longer pay its bills. On the 1st of July, the Paris Commercial Court opened judicial recovery proceedings. A court-appointed administrator named Marie-Hélène Montravert was given 28 days to find a viable reorganization plan. She could not. On the 29th of July, 2025, the court converted the case from recovery to liquidation, and Mansart, the Paris parent of a profitable Abidjan operator, was declared legally dead. On the 22nd of October, 2025, roughly 3 months after the liquidation order, the court-appointed administrator sold Anka. The buyer was a newly formed New York fashion company called Global Shop Group, led by a chief executive named Mathilde Cizé. Global Shop was not a strategic African acquirer. It was a fashion holding company, not yet a year old, with no operating history on the continent. The purchase price was undisclosed. Sector analysts widely reported it as well below the $13.5 million that had been invested. The 3 founders, Moulay Tabouret, Abdul Kadri Diallo, and Luc Perousseau Diallo, formally exited executive roles on the same day. 3 weeks after the sale closed, on the 12th of November, 2025, a 12.1 gigabyte database went up for sale on hacker forums. It contained 537,000 Anka user records, full names, emails, phone numbers, dates of birth, and, critically, authentication tokens. Global Shop, in its first month of ownership, did not issue an immediate public breach notice. Security researchers described the ownership transition as an ideal window of opportunity for the attackers, which is a specific technical euphemism for the observation that, at every corporate handover, the disciplines that keep a system secure fall apart, briefly, in the seam. And on the 6th of July, 2026, Moulay Tabouret resurfaced on the operating stage. His new job was country head in Côte d'Ivoire for a London-based mobility fintech called GoCab. GoCab runs premium ride-hailing vehicles, 1,200 of them in Côte d'Ivoire, 200 of them fully electric. It is the company's largest single-country operation. Moulay, in his public statement on the move, closed the loop that had opened in Bamako roughly a decade earlier. From the Sotrama of my early days to today's electric ride-hailing vehicles, he said, the issue remains the same. How to build more reliable, more professional, more inclusive, and more useful mobility. Anka, the platform, is still live in 2026. Global Shop is running it, the sellers are still selling, the DHL trucks are still moving. And in the African tech industry, in 2026, Anka has become the paradox everyone is arguing about. On one hand, it is proof that an export-first African consumer platform can actually reach break-even on a fraction of the capital its Anglophone peers burn through. That single data point changes the pitch that the next generation of African consumer founders can credibly make. On the other hand, it is proof that Paris parent capital structures carry a hidden risk. Development finance money is patient, but the legal entities it flows through are not always survivable. Founders raising rounds in 2026 are, for the first time, asking not just what the capital costs, but where the equity legally sits. In 2016, a Malian internal auditor stopped running a Bamako minibus, moved to Abidjan, and, with 2 co-founders, built a marketplace to let African artisans sell to buyers abroad. 9 years later, the company they built reached the milestone almost no funded African consumer platform had ever reached: operational break-even. And months after that, its Paris parent company was declared legally dead, and a New York fashion group nobody had heard of walked in and bought the whole thing at a fraction of what had been raised. This is a silly Africa. Every empire has an origin. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.